In the marble lobby of Sterling Tower, smoke curled thick and black through ventilation shafts as alarms shrieked their mechanical warning. Marcus Reed knelt on cold concrete, hands locked over a woman's sternum, counting compressions with the precision of 12 years. Military training had burned into muscle memory. 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythm, steady as artillery fire, 30 beats before he pinched her nose and sealed his mouth over hers. Victoria Sterling lay motionless beneath him, her red dress stark against gray dust lips the color of winter twilight. No breath stirred in her lungs. Marcus tilted her chin back and blew air from the portable oxygen tank he'd grabbed from the emergency cabinet, watching her chest rise with the inflation fall with release. Back to compressions. His shoulder screamed where he'd torn something, wrenching elevator doors apart with bare hands. But pain was irrelevant when death hovered this close. The woman had fired him 90 minutes ago in front of 24 witnesses, called security to escort him out like a criminal. Now his breath filled her lungs, his hands kept her heart beating, and the only thing standing between Victoria Sterling and a body bag was his refusal to let another person die on his watch. Her eyes flickered. A rattling gasp tore from her throat. Marcus rolled her to recovery position as violent coughs racked her frame, smoke and carbon monoxide purging from airways that had forgotten how to function. When her gaze finally focused, confused and wet with involuntary tears, recognition dawned, slow and terrible. The word came out, broken, barely audible over the sirens. "You came back." Marcus steadied her with one hand, the other checking her pulse. "Of course I did." Paramedics swarmed through the stairwell door, pushing him aside with professional efficiency, oxygen masks and IV lines, and the controlled chaos of emergency medicine. Victoria's hand reached for him as they lifted the gurney, and he caught it, squeezed once. Then the ambulance doors slammed shut and she was gone, and Marcus sat against the wall with blood on his knuckles and the taste of smoke in his mouth, wondering how his life had spiraled from morning pancakes to this in the span of 8 hours. 8 hours earlier, dawn broke gentle over the East Side tenements, where rent came cheap and hope came cheaper. Marcus had been awake since 5 old habits from Fort Benning, refusing to die even 3 years after discharge. The coffee percolated while he mixed pancake batter, cracked eggs with one hand, the way Sergeant Morrison had taught him in a mess hall outside Kandahar. Muscle memory made the movement smooth despite the cramped kitchen, despite the way his back still ached from yesterday's 12-hour shift mopping floors in a building that cost more per square foot than he'd earned in a decade. Emma stumbled out of her bedroom at 6:15, blonde hair, tangled from sleep, clutching the stuffed rabbit that had been Rachel's last gift before the drunk driver turned their lives inside out. At 7 years old, she was small for her age, all knees and elbows, and a brain that processed the world 3 grades ahead of her body. She climbed into the chair Marcus had reinforced last month when the original cracked under normal use. "Daddy, I finished the circuit board." Marcus set the plate down, golden pancakes arranged in a smiley face because that's what Rachel used to do. "The one for your science project." Emma nodded, syrup already pooling in enthusiastic puddles. "It lights up when you clap. Miss Peterson says it's too advanced for 2nd grade, but I don't care. I want to be an engineer like Uncle Dave." Uncle Dave fixed air conditioners for half the neighborhood and drank too much on weekends. But to Emma, he was Thomas Edison reborn. Marcus had learned not to correct her heroes. Let her dream big while the world was still small enough to hold them. He watched her eat, memorizing the moment the way he'd memorized 1,000 others since Rachel died. The morning light caught her hair just right, spun it into gold, and for a heartbeat, he saw his wife's smile in their daughter's face. Then Emma looked up, pancake sticky fingers reaching for her milk, and the spell broke. Her gaze drifted to the photograph on the refrigerator. Rachel, 26 and radiant, holding newborn. Emma Oss like she'd been born for nothing else. "Daddy, do you still miss Mommy?" The question landed like a gut punch, unexpected, even though she asked it every few months. Marcus sat down across from her, abandoned his own breakfast. "Every single day, sweetheart." Emma's eyes blue like her mother's had been, studied him with unnerving intensity. "But you're not sad all the time anymore." He wasn't sure how to explain that grief didn't disappear, just learned to coexist with living. That some mornings he still woke reaching for Rachel's warmth before memory crushed him. That he traded adrenaline and purpose for stability and loneliness because Emma needed a father more than the Army needed another ranger. Instead, he reached across the table, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I'm sad she's not here, but I'm happy every day that I have you. Emma considered this with the gravity of someone 3 times her age. Okay, can we get a dog? The shift made him laugh, tension breaking like river ice in spring. Maybe when we move somewhere with a yard. They both knew that wasn't happening on a janitor's salary, but Emma accepted the deflection with her usual grace. She finished breakfast talking about circuit boards and potential dog names while Marcus cleaned dishes and packed her lunch, each mundane action, a small rebellion against the chaos that had tried to destroy them. He walked her to school through streets that woke slow and resentful, past the bodega, where Mr. Chen always had candy for Emma, past the church with the cracked steps nobody fixed. At the school gates, she hugged him fierce and quick. Her voice carried absolute certainty, the kind only children possessed, before the world taught them doubt. You'll pick me up at 3:15, right? You always do. Marcus knelt eye level and made the promise he'd kept every single day since Rachel's funeral. I'll always be there for you, I promise. She ran toward the building, backpack bouncing, leaving him alone with the weight of vows he couldn't afford to break. He watched until she disappeared inside, then turned toward Sterling Tower in another day of invisible labor. The building rose 50 stories of steel and glass, a monument to the kind of wealth Marcus had stopped envying, somewhere between Kabul and Charleston. He clocked in at 7:45, changed into the gray coveralls that marked him as part of the machinery rather than the company, and began his rounds on the 38th floor. Most days the work was mindless. Mop the marble polish, the brass empty trash bins filled with discarded ideas from people who made his monthly salary in a week. He'd learned to disappear into the routine to let his hands work, while his mind wandered to Emma's science project, or the loose pipe in their bathroom he needed to fix before the landlord noticed. But at 8:15, pushing his cart past elevator 3, Marcus noticed the error codes flashing on the control panel. His hands stopped moving. Combat engineer training kicked in with the same visceral clarity that had saved his squad when that Humvee's brakes started grinding in the Helmand Valley. The diagnostic screen showed hydraulic pressure at 2,800 psi when safety threshold was 3,000. Cable tension asymmetric, left at 87%, right at 95. Warning timestamp indicated the system had been degrading for 6 hours. In another 12 hours, maybe less, those cables would snap under load, and whoever was inside would drop 40 floors before the emergency brakes engaged, if they engaged. Marcus pulled out his radio, keyed the maintenance channel. Dave, it's Marcus. We've got a problem with elevator 3, hydraulic failure pattern cable tension differential. This needs attention today. Static crackled before Dave's voice came through, thick with the dismissiveness Marcus had learned to expect. Probably just a sensor glitch. I'll put it on the list for Friday. Friday was 4 days away. Marcus stared at the error codes, remembering the Chinook that went down outside Kandahar because someone ignored warning signs. 12 men dead, their screams still woke him some nights. His voice came out harder than he intended. Dave, I've seen this pattern before. This is what hydraulic failure looks like right before catastrophic collapse. People could die. The radio went quiet long enough that Marcus thought the connection had dropped. Then Dave sighed, and Marcus could picture him shaking his head at the janitor who thought he knew better than the maintenance crew. Marcus, you push a mop. Leave the engineering to engineers. I'll check it when I check it. The line went dead. Marcus stood in the empty hallway, hands still on his radio, rage and helplessness warring in his chest. He could file a formal report, but that meant going over Dave's head, and maintenance workers who made waves found themselves transferred to overnight shifts or laid off during budget cuts. He needed this job. Emma needed this job. But someone was going to use that elevator. Someone was going to press the button and step inside and never imagine the machinery above their head was minutes from failure. Marcus made a decision. He'd watch elevator 3. If anyone tried to use it, he'd warn them directly. Let them think he was crazy. Better crazy than complicit in manslaughter. 44 floors above, Victoria Sterling stood at the window of her corner office and watched dawn paint the city in shades of amber and ash. She'd been here since 6, working through reports that should have been delegated, but she didn't trust anyone else to handle correctly. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago, her 3rd cup of the morning, and breakfast remained an abstract concept she'd address after the board meeting, if she survived the board meeting. Jessica Chen knocked once before entering, her executive assistant's face carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned when to show emotion and when to become furniture. "They're ready for you, conference room A." Victoria smoothed her navy suit, checked her reflection in the window glass. 34 years old and already the hollows under her eyes had become permanent, carved by too many nights choosing work over sleep. Her father used to say rest was for people without empires to build. He died of a heart attack at 62, still believing she was too soft to hold what he'd created. She'd spent 2 years proving him wrong, turning herself into exactly the kind of leader he'd demanded. Cold, calculating, uncompromising. And so profoundly alone, she sometimes forgot what warmth felt like. The board meeting started at 9 sharp. 12 members sat around the mahogany table, 11 men, and Victoria, their combined net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. Richard Caldwell, her CFO, stood at the presentation screen with quarterly reports that told a story Victoria already knew would be weaponized against her. Richard was 45 and handsome in the way expensive suits and good genes created his silver temples, lending gravitas to words that dripped poison wrapped in concern. Q3 revenue decreased 7% from Q2. We lost the Tokyo contract to Matsumoto Industries. Cash reserves are down 15% year over year. Board member Harrison's 60-something and bitter that Charles Sterling had chosen his daughter over more qualified candidates, leaned forward with predatory interest. "Ms. Sterling, this is the second consecutive quarter of declining performance. Do you have an explanation?" Victoria kept her voice level professional even as her stomach twisted. "We're restructuring our supply chain to reduce dependence on overseas manufacturing. The initial investment is significant, but long-term projections show." Harrison cut her off with the casual cruelty of someone who'd been dismissing women his entire career. "Projections. Your father didn't deal in projections. He dealt in results. This board is beginning to question whether you have the experience necessary to lead this company." The words landed like physical blows. Victoria felt heat crawl up her neck, forced it down through sheer will. Around the table, other members exchanged glances, some sympathetic, most calculating the political cost of supporting or abandoning her. Richard stepped in with perfect timing, his voice carrying just the right note of supportive concern. "Gentlemen, I think we need to acknowledge that Victoria is doing her best under difficult circumstances. However, given the current trajectory, perhaps we should consider bringing in additional senior leadership. Someone with more operational experience to support her during this transitional period." The phrasing was masterful. Not a direct attack, but an implication that Victoria needed a handler, that she was failing and required rescue. She met Richard's eyes across the table and saw satisfaction there, carefully masked but unmistakable. The meeting dragged on for another 90 minutes, death by 1,000 questions. When it finally ended, Victoria walked to her office on legs that threatened to buckle, locked the door, and stood at the window, while rage and terror fought for dominance. Her father's voice echoed from memory, the last words he'd spoken before the heart attack took him. "Adelaide, you're too soft. You care too much what people think. This business will eat you alive." She changed her name to Victoria after he died, a small rebellion against his constant comparisons to her soft-hearted mother. Became harder, colder, more ruthless. Fired anyone who questioned her, promoted those who showed absolute loyalty. Built walls so high around herself that she'd forgotten what connection felt like. And still they thought she was weak. Still they questioned whether she deserved the office her father had occupied. Victoria checked her watch. 2:45. She had reports to review, calls to make, an empire to defend. She grabbed her tablet and headed for the elevator, heels clicking against marble with the rhythm of someone marching into battle. The lobby was crowded with employees returning from late lunch. Victoria ignored them with practiced ease, scanning for elevator 3 because it served the executive floors directly, and she didn't have time for the local elevator stops on every floor. A man stepped in front of her. Gray coveralls, mop bucket on wheels, face she wouldn't remember if she saw it tomorrow. Nobody important. His voice was calm, respectful, and completely inappropriate for someone of his station addressing her directly. "Ma'am, you need to use a different elevator. This one's showing mechanical failures." Victoria stopped. The lobby conversation dropped to whispers as people turned to watch. She felt their eyes, felt the weight of assumption that she didn't know her own building, that a janitor needed to instruct her on safety. The board meeting was still raw. Harrison's voice still rang in her ears. And now this man, This nobody in maintenance coveralls was making her look incompetent in front of her employees. She looked at him the way she'd learned to look at obstacles. Cold, dismissive, final. You're a janitor. I don't take orders from janitors. Marcus met her gaze without flinching, and something in his eyes unsettled her. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of quiet certainty that suggested he knew things she didn't. I'm not giving orders, ma'am. I'm giving you information that could save your life. The hydraulic system is failing. The cables are under uneven tension. This elevator is dangerous. The murmurs grew louder. Victoria felt control slipping, felt the narrative forming around her. The CEO who needed a janitor to tell her about building maintenance. The woman who couldn't manage her own infrastructure. Harrison would hear about this within the hour, and it would become another data point in the case against her leadership. She made a choice. The wrong choice driven by pride and fear and the desperate need to appear unshakable. Step aside or step into my office to collect your final paycheck. Marcus didn't move. His jaw tightened and she watched him make his own calculation. Saw the moment he chose principle over employment. Ma'am, please. People die in accidents like this. I've seen it happen. Just use elevator 2. The lobby had gone silent now. 20-some employees watching their CEO confronted by maintenance staff, watching to see who would break first. Victoria felt something crack inside her, some final reserve of patience or humanity, and her voice came out colder than she'd known she could make it. She spoke slowly, clearly, making sure everyone heard. You're fired, effective immediately. Security will escort you out. The words hung in the air between them. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria saw it all play across his face. Frustration, resignation, and something that looked disturbingly like pity. He nodded once, stepped aside with careful dignity, and walked toward the service stairs. Victoria pressed the call button for elevator 3. The doors opened with a cheerful chime that promised safety, efficiency, all the things her father had built this company to represent. She stepped inside alone. The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. On the 40th floor in an office most employees didn't know existed. Richard Caldwell stood at his window and watched the lobby through a monitor feed he'd installed 6 months ago. He'd watched the confrontation play out, watched Victoria fire the one man who might have saved her, and allowed himself a small smile. The hydraulic sabotage had been subtle patient work, degrading the system slowly over weeks so it would look like normal equipment failure. He'd expected the collapse to happen during morning rush, when the elevator was full, maximizing casualties and chaos. Victoria alone was almost too perfect. Almost. Richard pulled out his phone, opened the encrypted messaging app, typed 3 words to his contact at the building inspection office. Elevator 3, today. Then he poured himself scotch and waited for the sirens. Marcus was 3 flights down the service stairs when the building shook. Not violently, not earthquake or explosion, but a deep shudder that traveled through steel and concrete like a dying breath. His radio erupted with static and voices. The words came through, broken, panicked. Code red, all units, elevator 3, floor 42, fire and smoke, possible passenger, trapped inside. He didn't think, dropped his bucket, grabbed the stair rail and ran up. His legs burned by floor 15, lungs screamed by 30. He'd climbed mountains in Afghanistan with 80 pounds of gear, could do 42 flights now. Had to. At 25, a security guard named Kevin stepped into his path, hand up in a stop gesture that would have been comical if Marcus wasn't watching someone die in his mind. Sir, you need to evacuate down. You were just fired. HR sent out the notification. You are not authorized. Marcus didn't slow. Kevin grabbed his shoulder, and Marcus turned, let the guard see whatever was in his eyes, the thing that had made Taliban fighters back down in Kandahar. Someone is dying up there. You can arrest me after I save them. Kevin's hand dropped. Marcus kept running. Floor 42 was chaos. Smoke poured from the elevator shaft, thick and black and toxic. Emergency personnel were 3 minutes out at best. Marcus ran to the control panel, scanned the diagnostics through burning eyes. Elevator stuck between floors. Cabin doors jammed. Hydraulic fluid leak plus electrical short equals fire equals death. Through the small window in the shaft door, he could see her. Victoria Sterling crumpled on the elevator floor, not moving. Red dress like a wound against the gray smoke. Marcus grabbed the fire axe from the emergency cabinet. The elevator doors were reinforced steel designed to withstand exactly this kind of forced entry. He swung anyway. Once, twice, metal denting but not breaking. His hands went numb with the impact. Swing 3 drew blood where the axe handle tore his palm. Swing 10 finally cracked the steel. He dropped the axe, wedged his fingers into the crack, and pulled. Something in his shoulder gave way with a pop and a wash of pain that would have dropped him if adrenaline wasn't already running the show. The doors groaned, shifted open 18 inches. Enough. Marcus squeezed through into smoke so thick he couldn't see his hands. Found Victoria by touch, grabbed her under the arms, dragged her backward through the gap. Her head lolled against his chest, completely limp, and terror spiked through him because he'd seen dead bodies before, and she felt too much like them. The stairwell was clearer emergency ventilation pulling the smoke up and out. Marcus laid Victoria on the concrete, tilted her head back, checked for breathing. Nothing. No rise of chest, no whisper of air. He pressed 2 fingers to her carotid artery and found a pulse so faint and irregular, it might as well have been absent. Combat medic training took over with the clarity of instinct. Carbon monoxide, poisoning smoke inhalation, cardiac arrest from oxygen deprivation. Minutes until brain damage became irreversible. Maybe seconds. Marcus sprinted to the fire cabinet, grabbed the portable oxygen tank mounted inside. Most janitors wouldn't have known it was there, but most janitors hadn't spent 12 years learning to find life-saving equipment in combat zones where seconds separated survival from body bags. Back to Victoria. He interlaced his fingers, placed them on her sternum, between her breasts, locked his elbows, and began compressions. 30 beats at 100 per minute, the rhythm burned into muscle memory from 100 training sessions. 1, 2, 3. His weight driving through his palms, her chest compressing 5 centimeters with each thrust, ribs flexing under his hands. At 30, he stopped, opened the oxygen tank, fitted the mask over her face. Squeezed the ambu bag twice, watching her chest rise and fall with artificial respiration. The mask wasn't sealing properly against her skin. Not enough oxygen getting through. Marcus made a decision. Removed the mask, tilted her chin up, with one hand pinched her nose, closed with the other. Put his mouth over hers and breathed, filling her lungs with oxygen-rich air straight from his own. Her lips were cold, wrong, nothing like breathing should feel. He breathed again, watched her chest rise. Back to compressions. Push, 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 the world narrowing to rhythm and repetition and the desperate need to make her heart remember how to beat. Sweat ran into his eyes, dripped onto her face. His shoulder was a white-hot agony where he'd torn it, but pain was irrelevant when death waited. 90 seconds in flashback hit him like a right hook. Rachel in the ICU machines, beeping their monotone dirge, doctors stepping back after 20 minutes of useless CPR. Time of death, 22:47. Emma crying in the waiting room, asking when mommy would wake up. The memory tried to drown him. Marcus shoved it down, compressed harder. No, not again. Not this time. 30 compressions, 2 breaths, her lips still cold against his, but maybe less so. Maybe that was wishful thinking. 30 more compressions, his arms shaking now, muscles burning. 2 more breaths. The third cycle was desperation. Marcus heard his own voice, harsh and broken, talking to her like she could hear. Come on, come on, don't you dare die on me. Victoria's body convulsed. A gasping, rattling sound tore from her throat, half cough, half scream. Her back arched as her lungs remembered their purpose, air flooding in with violent urgency. She coughed until Marcus thought she'd break smoke and carbon monoxide purging in thick, wet sounds that were the most beautiful thing he'd ever heard. He rolled her to her side, recovery position, hand on her shoulder, while she fought for breath. Her eyes opened unfocused and swimming with tears that were purely physiological, the body's response to trauma. When her gaze finally found his face, recognition came slow and painful. The word was barely audible, forced through a throat scraped raw. You came back. Marcus checked her pulse again, strong now, regular. Breathing ragged, but present. Of course I did. Sirens wailed closer. Paramedics burst through the stairwell door with equipment and efficiency, pushing Marcus aside with professional courtesy that didn't allow argument. They fitted an oxygen mask, started an IV, checked vitals while calling information to the incoming ambulance. Victoria's hand reached out from the gurney, weak and trembling. Marcus caught it, squeezed gently. Her eyes held questions she didn't have breath to ask. He stayed until they lifted her into the ambulance, until the doors closed and the sirens faded into city noise. Then he sat against the wall, hands shaking, shoulders screaming, and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Mercy General Hospital smelled like disinfectant and desperation. Victoria woke 6 hours later in a private room that cost more per night than most people earned in a week, though she didn't know that and wouldn't have cared. Her throat felt like she'd swallowed broken glass. Her chest ached where ribs had flexed under compression, and when she tried to sit up, the world spun sideways. Jessica Chen sat in the visitor chair, laptop balanced on her knees, typing with hands that trembled just enough to notice. When she saw Victoria's eyes open, relief and something harder flooded her face. The words came out thick with emotion Jessica normally kept locked down. "You're awake, thank God." The doctor said. She stopped, swallowed, started again. "You stopped breathing. You were dead." Victoria touched her throat, winced. "What happened?" Jessica set the laptop aside, leaned forward with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting hours to say this. "Elevator malfunction. Hydraulic failure, electrical fire explosion. You were trapped. Carbon monoxide poisoning." She paused and her voice dropped. Marcus Reed climbed 42 flights of stairs, broke through the elevator doors with a fire axe and pulled you out. He performed CPR for 90 seconds. You weren't breathing. He brought you back. The memory came in fragments. Darkness, pressure on her chest. Something covering her mouth, not smoke, but air clean. And living, a voice saying, "Don't die," saying, "Come on," saying, "Breathe." Lips pressed to hers, warm and insistent, breathing life back into lungs that had forgotten their purpose. Victoria's hand went to her mouth, found her lips tender, slightly bruised from the force of rescue breathing. He did CPR. Jessica's expression shifted into something Victoria had never seen from her assistant. Disappointment, raw and unfiltered. "Yes, and then he left. Refused any reward, any publicity. He said he just did what needed doing." The pause that followed carried weight. "And you never thanked him. You fired him, and he saved your life, and you never even said thank you." The words hit harder than the elevator collapse. Victoria stared at the ceiling, at the acoustic tiles that all looked identical, and felt shame flood through her in ways she'd trained herself not to feel. Shame was weakness. Regret was failure. Her father had taught her to bury both. But lying here in a hospital bed alive, only because a man she'd humiliated had refused to let her die, Victoria couldn't bury anything. She replayed the confrontation in the lobby, Marcus warning her about the elevator, her dismissing him not because he was wrong, but because accepting his warning meant looking weak in front of employees who already questioned her competence. The board meeting had destroyed her confidence, and she'd lashed out at the nearest target. Marcus had been right. She'd been wrong, and she'd fired him for trying to save her life. The realization went deeper. Victoria closed her eyes and let memory take her back 10 years to her father's office, to the conversation that had shaped everything after. She'd been 24, fresh from Harvard Business School, full of ideas about corporate responsibility and employee welfare. Her father had listened to her proposal for a wellness program with the patience of someone humoring a child. His voice had been calm, almost gentle, which made the words cut deeper. "Adelaide, you're too soft. You want to coddle these people like they're family. They're not. They're resources, tools. You replace them when they break." She'd argued, cited studies showing happy employees were productive employees. Her father had cut her off with a wave of his hand. "This softness will destroy you. Business isn't for people with feelings. You need to be harder, colder, or you'll lose everything I've built." 2 years later, he died, his last words a prophecy of her failure. Victoria had spent the next decade becoming exactly what he demanded. Hard, cold, uncompromising. She'd built walls so high around herself that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be human. And today, those walls had nearly killed her. Victoria thought about the kiss. Not romantic, not gentle, but desperate and necessary, and full of a kind of care she hadn't felt in years. Marcus had pressed his mouth to hers and breathed his air into her lungs and refused to let her die, even after she'd destroyed his livelihood. When was the last time anyone had fought for her? Not for her company, not for her money, but for her life, her existence as a person who mattered. She couldn't remember. Her voice came out rough, scraped raw. Jessica, I need Marcus Reed's address. Jessica pulled out her phone without hesitation, and Victoria realized her assistant had been waiting for this. Already have it. The neighborhood was 40 minutes from the hospital, in a part of the city where Victoria's car drew stares like a peacock in a coal mine. She dressed in jeans and a sweater, the most casual clothes she owned, though even those probably cost more than a month's rent here. The apartment building was worn brick 3 stories, the kind of place that had been nice in the 70s and was now just trying to stay standing. Victoria climbed the stairs slowly, her body still recovering from smoke inhalation, and stopped at door 17. She knocked, waited, heard small footsteps approaching. The girl who opened the door was 7 years old, blonde hair, in pigtails, wearing overalls covered in carefully sewn patches of different colors. She held a screwdriver in one hand and what looked like the disassembled guts of a transistor radio in the other. Blue eyes studied Victoria with the kind of unfiltered curiosity children possessed before the world taught them to hide it. The words came out matter of fact, no fear or deference. "Hello, are you lost?" Victoria found herself smiling for the first time in months. "I'm looking for Marcus Reed. Is your dad home?" The girl turned and yelled with the volume only small children achieve naturally. "Daddy, there's a pretty lady here, pretty." When was the last time anyone had called Victoria pretty instead of powerful or intimidating or ice queen? Marcus appeared in the doorway, and shock crossed his face before he could hide it. He wore faded jeans and an old army shirt, feet bare, completely domestic, in a way that made Victoria realize she'd never seen him as anything but furniture in a maintenance uniform. His voice was careful, neutral. "Ms. Sterling." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "Victoria, please. Can I come in?" He hesitated, and she watched him calculate the cost of saying no versus the awkwardness of saying yes. Then he stepped aside. The apartment was small, maybe 600 square feet total, but immaculately kept. Toys organized in labeled bins, dishes drying in a rack, framed photographs of a beautiful dark-haired woman everywhere, smiling from walls and shelves, frozen in moments of joy that Victoria envied without fully understanding why. The little girl was still watching her with scientific interest. Victoria knelt down, bringing herself to the child's eye level. "What's your name?" She held up the radio components. "Emma Reed. I'm building a crystal radio. It's harder than YouTube makes it look." Victoria glanced at Marcus, saw pride and grief war across his face. She looked back at Emma. "I came to apologize to your father. He tried to help me, and I was very mean to him." Emma considered this with gravity beyond her years. "Daddy says even when people are mean, we should still help them if they need it, because everyone is fighting something we can't see." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. This 7-year-old child understood more about compassion than she'd learned in 34 years of corporate warfare. She looked up at Marcus. "You're raising an incredible person." Something in his face softened. "Trying my best." He sent Emma to her room with gentle firmness, and when they were alone, the silence stretched uncomfortable and necessary. Victoria stood in the middle of this small, perfect space and felt her carefully constructed world crack a little wider. She made herself say the words, "I came to apologize and to offer you your job back with a significant raise." Marcus's expression didn't change. "I don't want it." Victoria blinked. "I don't understand." His voice was gentle but absolutely firm. "I don't want to work for someone who only values me because I saved their life. I want to work for someone who values me because I'm good at what I do." He paused, let that land. "You didn't fire me because I was bad at my job. You fired me because I made you look weak in front of people whose opinions you cared about. That's not an environment I want to return to." The truth of it crushed her. Victoria sat down without asking permission, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. "You're right. I was wrong. She struggled for honesty that had become foreign. "I was scared. The board is trying to push me out. I'm losing control of my own company. And when you stopped me in front of everyone, all I could think about was how weak I looked." Marcus looked at the photographs of his wife, and his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. Accepting help isn't weakness. The statement hung between them, simple and devastating. Victoria heard herself speak before she knew what she was saying. "I don't know how to not be alone." He met her eyes. "It's a practice. You get better at it." She should leave, should respect his decision and go. But something kept her brouted, some need she couldn't name to understand this man who'd breathed life back into her lungs. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. You lost someone. Marcus nodded to the photographs. Rachel, 3 years ago. Drunk driver. I was deployed, didn't make it home in time. The grief in his words was old, worn smooth by repetition, but still sharp enough to cut. After she died, I had to learn to accept help. Neighbors bringing meals. Teachers helping Emma. Strangers holding doors when I was carrying groceries and a sleeping kid. He looked at Victoria. I learned that people offering help aren't trying to prove you're weak. They're trying to prove you're not alone. Victoria felt something inside her break, some wall she'd maintained for so long she'd forgotten it was there. Tears threatened, and she blinked them back, but not before Marcus saw. She stood heading for the door before she could embarrass herself further. I should go. I'm sorry for taking your time. Emma's voice called from her room. Will you come back? I like you. Victoria looked at Marcus, found him watching her with an expression she couldn't read. He shrugged, and the smallest smile touched his face. Doors always open. She made it to her car before the tears came, sat in the driver's seat with her hands shaking, and let herself cry for the first time since her father's funeral. Not from sadness, though that was there. From relief. From the overwhelming weight of being seen, really seen as something other than a CEO or a sterling or a failure. Marcus had looked at her dying and chosen to save her anyway. Had looked at her cruelty and chosen kindness. Had offered her a truth she'd spent 10 years running from. Victoria drove home through twilight streets, touching her lips where they were still tender from CPR, and wondered if it was possible to learn how to be human again. Richard Caldwell's office occupied the 44th floor, one level below Victoria's, a proximity that had grated on him for 2 years like sand under a perfectly fitted suit. He stood at the window, now tumbler of 18-year Macallan in hand, watching the evening news cycle through its predictable beats. Local anchor, perfectly coiffed and empty behind the eyes, recited the Sterling Tower incident with manufactured concern. The words scrolled across the bottom of the screen in that authoritative font news producers believed conveyed truth. Sterling Industries CEO survives elevator accident. Employee performs dramatic rescue. Investigation ongoing. Richard permitted himself a smile, small and private. The investigation would find exactly what he'd designed it to find. Mechanical failure. Infrastructure. Tragic near miss that raised serious questions about building maintenance and, by extension, management oversight. The board would have fresh ammunition against Victoria, and Richard would position himself as the steady hand needed to restore confidence. Except Victoria wasn't supposed to survive. The hydraulic sabotage had been calculated to fail during peak hours when the elevator carried multiple passengers, maximizing both casualties and chaos. A CEO dying alone in a malfunctioning elevator was still useful, but it lacked the spectacle Richard had orchestrated. And then there was Marcus Reed. Richard pulled up the employee file on his tablet, scrolling through information that should have triggered alerts 6 months ago when he'd first begun his campaign. Former Army Ranger, 12 years active duty, combat engineer specialty, Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan. The kind of background that meant technical expertise, pattern recognition, the ability to identify sabotage when most people saw accident. The fact that Marcus had been working as a janitor was either the universe's joke or its warning. Richard had missed it, dismissed the maintenance staff as invisible and irrelevant, and that oversight had nearly cost him everything. His phone buzzed with a text from the private investigator he kept on retainer. Subject visited target's apartment. Duration 47 minutes. Departed visibly emotional. Photos attached. Richard opened the attachments. Victoria's Tesla parked on a street where cars like that invited vandalism. Victoria at Marcus's door. Victoria leaving with her face in her hands, clearly crying. The CFO set his drink down and began making calculations. Victoria developing personal attachment to her rescuer complicated things, but complications were just variables requiring adjustment. If Marcus became an ally, a confidant, someone Victoria trusted enough to share concerns about company operations, he might piece together the pattern of system failures. The elevator was supposed to look isolated. Add it to the HVAC malfunction, the fire suppression test failure, the generator errors, and someone with military engineering background might recognize deliberate sabotage. Richard made a call. The man who answered didn't offer a name, just confirmation that he was listening. The instructions came out precise and cold. I need surveillance on Marcus Reed. Find out what he knows, what he's told Victoria Sterling. And I need leverage. The voice on the other end was flat professional. Parameters, Richard considered. He has a daughter, 7 years old. Don't touch her unless absolutely necessary, but make sure he knows she's vulnerable. Scare him. Make him understand the cost of asking questions. The line went dead. Richard poured himself another scotch and pulled up the files he'd been assembling for 2 years. Project Sterling Fall encrypted and backed up to servers in the Cayman Islands. Timeline of sabotage. Financial projections. Stock manipulation records. The blueprint for a hostile takeover that would put Richard where he'd always belonged. He thought back to the board meeting 2 years ago, the announcement that had changed everything. Charles Sterling's daughter, barely 30, chosen over Richard's 15 years of experience and Stanford MBA. The humiliation of it still burned. He'd built this company as much as Charles had generated the strategies that turned millions into billions, and his reward was watching some legacy hire step into the role he'd earned. Richard had smiled through the announcement, congratulated Victoria publicly, spent the next week planning her destruction. The sabotage had started small, test runs to ensure he could access building systems remotely without triggering IT security. An HVAC malfunction here, a fire suppression glitch there. Nothing catastrophic, just enough to establish a pattern of infrastructure decay that would later seem inevitable. The elevator had been the crescendo. Richard had spent weeks degrading the hydraulic system, careful to make the failure look mechanical rather than deliberate. The plan was elegant. Victoria Dye's company stock crashes. Richard's shell corporation swoops in with a buyout offer the board couldn't refuse. He becomes CEO, the savior who rescued Sterling Industries from the chaos of inadequate leadership. Except Marcus Reed had climbed 42 flights of stairs and performed CPR with the kind of skill that suggested medical training alongside combat experience. Now Victoria was alive, Marcus was a complication, and Richard's timeline was accelerating, whether he wanted it to or not. The international contract signing was scheduled for Friday. If that deal went through, Sterling's stock would surge and the takeover window would close. Richard had 48 hours to either stop the signing or eliminate the people who might expose him. He opened his laptop, connected through the VPN that masked his digital footprint, and began uploading the final phase of his malware. Fire suppression override, electrical grid cascade, emergency exit locks. A catastrophic failure that would trap everyone in the building during the signing ceremony and destroy the server room where evidence of his sabotage lived in backup files. The timer was set for Friday at 2:15, 15 minutes into the ceremony, when Victoria would be surrounded by international partners, board members, and press. The building would become a death trap, and Richard would be conveniently off-site, establishing an alibi that would hold up under any investigation. He double-checked the code, erased his access logs, and closed the laptop. Poured a third scotch. Wondered if Marcus Reed understood yet that trying to be a hero would get him and everyone he loved killed. 3 days after Victoria's visit, Marcus walked Emma home from school through streets that had started to feel different lately. Not dangerous exactly, but watched. He'd noticed the black SUV twice now, once outside Emma's school and once parked across from their building. Military training had taught him to trust pattern recognition over coincidence. Emma chattered beside him about her science project, something involving water filtration and activated charcoal that she'd learned from YouTube. Marcus listened with half his attention, while the other half tracked exits and potential threats, the old combat awareness surfacing like muscle memory he couldn't shake. The sun was setting early now. Autumn pressing toward winter shadows stretching long between buildings. Emma's hand was warm in his, small and trusting, and Marcus found himself calculating how fast he could move if those shadows produced threats. He saw them before Emma did. 3 men on the sidewalk ahead, another 2 behind the classic pincer formation that spoke to military or law enforcement training. They weren't pretending to be casual. This was meant to be noticed. Marcus's voice came out calm, gentle, the tone he used when Emma woke from nightmares about the mother she barely remembered. "Sweetheart, I need you to hold on to Daddy's belt. Don't let go no matter what happens. Can you do that?" Emma's chatter stopped. She was smart enough to hear the fear underneath his calm, young enough not to understand why it was there. Her fingers found his belt and gripped tight. Okay, Daddy. The lead man had a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the kind that came from poorly stitched combat wounds. His stance was familiar, the way operators carried themselves when violence was a tool they'd mastered. He stopped 5 feet away, blocking the sidewalk with casual authority. His voice carried the flat affect of someone delivering a message he didn't care enough to personalize. Marcus Reed, we need to talk. Marcus kept walking until the distance closed to 3 feet, close enough to read intent in the man's eyes, far enough to react if hands moved toward weapons. So talk. The scar shifted as the man's expression hardened. You stuck your nose where it doesn't belong. Saved the wrong person. Now you need to forget what you saw. Forget faulty elevators. Forget Victoria Sterling. Walk away. Behind Marcus's back, Emma pressed closer, silent now, her breathing fast and shallow against his spine. The other men had moved in, surrounding them in a loose circle that gave the illusion of escape while cutting off every real exit. Marcus's voice stayed level, but something older rose behind it, the part of him that had survived 12 years of combat by reading threats before they materialized. I don't know what you're talking about. Scar Eye stepped closer, close enough that Marcus could smell cigarettes and cheap cologne. Don't play stupid. You keep digging, bad things happen. To you. His eyes flicked down. To your kid. The world went red at the edges. Every instinct Marcus had spent 3 years bearing surged back with crystal clarity. Nobody threatened Emma. Not ever. Not while he had breath in his body. His voice came out quiet, deadly, the tone that had made Taliban fighters reconsider their life choices in Helmand province. You just made a mistake. Scar Eye smirked, misreading Marcus's stillness for fear. Big words for a janitor. The first man swung fast, a right hook meant to intimidate rather than seriously damage. Marcus was faster. Caught the wrist mid-swing, stepped inside the man's guard, and drove his elbow into the solar plexus with enough force to collapse a lung. The attacker doubled over, gasping, and Marcus used his momentum to throw him sideways into the second man. They crashed into a parked car with the sound of breaking glass. The third man came from behind with a knife blade angled up toward Marcus's kidney, the kind of strike that suggested professional training. Marcus heard the footsteps, spun, blocked the knife hand with his left forearm, while his right palm struck the man's throat. Not hard enough to crush the windpipe, but enough to make breathing an urgent concern. The knife clattered onto concrete and skittered under the car. Scar Eye pulled a collapsible baton, flicked it open with a metallic snap that echoed between buildings. He swung at Marcus's head with the kind of commitment that meant he'd done this before. Marcus ducked, felt the baton whistle past close enough to stir his hair, heard it shatter the car window behind him. Glass exploded outward in a spray of safety fragments. Emma screamed, short and sharp, the sound of a child's fear cutting through everything else. Marcus felt something in his chest crack at that sound, some wall between who he'd been and who he'd become. His voice came out harder than he intended. Emma, close your eyes. Don't look. He backed toward the building wall, limiting the angles of attack, keeping Emma behind him, where she couldn't see what was about to happen. The 5 men regrouped, and Marcus watched them calculate odds, saw the moment they committed to overwhelming him through numbers. The second attacker recovered enough to function, rushed in low. Marcus sidestepped in, hooked his ankle, sent him face first into the pavement. The wet crunch of breaking nose was followed by a scream, the man rolling away with blood streaming between his fingers. Scar Eye came at him with the baton again. Overhead, swing meant to crush bone. Marcus caught it mid-arc with both hands, yanked it away with a twist that dislocated the man's thumb, used the baton to strike his knee. The cartilage gave way with a sound like celery snapping, and Scar Eye went down howling. The third attacker, throat still damaged from Marcus's strike, pulled a second knife and lunged wild. Marcus deflected the blade with the baton, stepped in close, and brought his elbow down on the man's collarbone. Another crack, another scream, another threat neutralized. A car horn blared long and insistent. Victoria's Tesla mounted the curb at an angle that spoke to panic rather than precision, doors flying open before the car fully stopped. She was running toward them, phone held high, her voice carrying the kind of fury that made the remaining attackers hesitate. The words came out in a shout that echoed off brick and glass. I called the police, they're coming. Scar Eye looked at his broken crew, at Victoria's phone recording everything, and made a decision. He limped backward, gesturing to the others. This isn't over. They scattered three men supporting each other, leaving blood on the sidewalk and the smell of violence hanging thick in the autumn air. Marcus stood breathing hard, still holding the baton, scanning for additional threats his training insisted might exist. Emma was crying now, silent tears that soaked into his jeans where she pressed her face against his legs. Victoria dropped to her knees in front of Emma, and Marcus watched her face transform from CEO Ice to something rawer, more human than he'd seen before. Her hands hovered over Emma's shoulders, asking permission before touching. The words came out gentle, desperate. "Sweetheart, are you okay? Did they hurt you?" Emma shook her head, then launched herself at Victoria with the kind of total trust children gave before the world taught them caution. Victoria caught her wrapped arms around the small body, shaking with sobs, and looked up at Marcus with eyes that held terror and guilt and something deeper he couldn't name. Her voice left no room for argument. "You're coming with me. Both of you. Right now." Marcus's hands were still shaking from adrenaline-crashed knuckles split where they'd connected with bone. He looked at his daughter crying against a woman they barely knew, at the blood on the concrete, and at the world that had just proven his worst fears justified. He heard himself answer before conscious thought caught up. "What?" Victoria stood still, holding Emma, and her expression carried the weight of someone making a decision that terrified her. "They found you because of me. I won't let you die because of me." Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Marcus felt the moment stretch, felt all the reasons he should refuse, warring with the knowledge that Emma wasn't safe anymore, that whoever had sent those men would send more, that his ability to protect her alone had just been proven inadequate. Emma's voice, muffled against Victoria's shoulder, made the choice for him. "Daddy, I'm scared." Marcus nodded once, picked up Emma's backpack from where it had fallen during the fight, and followed Victoria to her car. The penthouse occupied the entire 50th floor of a building that made Sterling Tower look modest. Glass walls on three sides offered panoramic city views, the kind of real estate that existed in a different economic reality than Marcus had ever inhabited. Security was visible and invisible. Doormen who looked like they moonlighted as bodyguards. Cameras in every hallway. Keycard access that required biometric confirmation. Emma's eyes went wide as they stepped off the private elevator. She'd stopped crying in the car, her resilience reasserting itself the way children's did when the immediate threat passed. Now she walked through Victoria's space with the careful wonder of someone visiting a museum. Her fingers traced the silk curtains, the marble countertops, the glass table that probably cost more than Marcus's yearly salary. When she found the windows, she pressed her face against them and stared at the city, glittering below like a field of fallen stars. The whisper carried absolute awe. "Daddy, we're in the ski." Marcus stood in the entryway, feeling displacement settle over him like ill-fitting clothes. The guest suite Victoria led them to was larger than their entire apartment, decorated in whites and creams that seemed designed to show every mark of living. Emma would have fingerprints on those walls within an hour. He'd have guilt about accepting this within minutes. Victoria was already on the phone, her voice dropping into CEO mode with practiced ease. "Daniel, I need 24/7 security detail on Marcus Reed and Emma Reed, threat level active. I want bodyguards who know how to handle professional operators, not mall cops with badges. Authorization code Sterling Alpha 1. She listened to whatever response came through her free hand, rubbing absently at her chest where ribs had been compressed during sleep. "I don't care what it costs. I don't care if you have to pull people from other details. These are the people who saved my life and someone just tried to kill them. Make it happen." When she hung up, Marcus found himself speaking before he could filter the words. "I can protect my daughter." Victoria's expression softened in ways that suggested she understood the pride underneath his protest. "I know you can. You just proved that. But that attack was because of me, because you saved me. So now I'm going to make sure you're safe." She paused and something vulnerable flickered across her face. "Please let me do this." Emma wandered out of the guest bedroom, drawn by voices, and climbed onto Victoria's couch with the unself-conscious ease of children who hadn't learned about designer furniture. Her shoes left small marks on the cream leather that Victoria didn't seem to notice. The question came with the directness only 7-year-olds possessed. "Can we stay here? It's really pretty." Victoria looked at Marcus, and he saw his own exhaustion reflected there. Saw the calculation she was doing the same one he'd done. those men would come back. Maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but they'd come back with more people or better weapons or during a moment when Marcus wasn't ready. He couldn't protect Emma from that kind of determined threat, not alone, not without the resources and support he'd lost when he left the military. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford when his daughter's safety was the price. His voice came out quiet, defeated in ways that hurt more than the torn shoulder. Okay, but just until it's safe. Victoria ordered dinner from a restaurant that didn't have prices on the menu, the kind of place where Marcus would have felt uncomfortable in his best clothes. She called back twice to ask about children's meals, what 7-year-olds actually ate, whether chicken fingers counted as real food. They ate at Victoria's dining table, Emma swinging her legs in a chair too tall for her, asking questions about the building and the city and why Victoria lived alone in a space big enough for 10 people. Victoria answered with surprising patience, her corporate armor cracking to reveal someone uncertain but trying. Emma, halfway through her third chicken finger, delivered the question with the casual brutality children specialized in. Why don't you have kids? Victoria's hand froze on her wine glass. For a moment, she looked caught exposed, someone forced to confront a truth she'd been avoiding. I never had time. Emma considered this with the gravity of someone who understood loss better than most adults. That's sad. Kids are great. The laugh that escaped Victoria was genuine surprise out of her. You make a very compelling argument. Marcus watched them from across the table, his heart doing complicated things in his chest. Emma had warmed to Victoria with the speed of a child who'd been starved for maternal attention, and Victoria was responding with a kind of careful tenderness that suggested she'd never been around children but was willing to learn. Something dangerous was happening here. Something that involved feelings Marcus had locked away after Rachel died, that involved hope he couldn't afford, that involved the possibility of building something new from the wreckage of everything he'd lost. Later, after Emma had fallen asleep in the guest room, clutching the stuffed rabbit that went everywhere with her, Marcus and Victoria sat on the balcony with wine neither was really drinking. The city spread below them like a circuit board, lights marking the paths people traveled through darkness. Victoria broke the silence with a question he'd been expecting. Those men today, they were professionals. Marcus nodded, watching the traffic patterns 50 floors down. Military or law enforcement background, at least one of them. She wrapped her arms around herself despite the mild evening. They knew your name. They knew about the elevator. This wasn't random. The conclusion he'd been avoiding settled between them with the weight of inevitability. Someone's cleaning up loose ends. Someone who doesn't want the elevator failure investigated too closely. Victoria's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, and Marcus heard fear there she was trying to hide. I think someone's trying to destroy my company, and I think they'll kill anyone who gets in their way. The silence that followed carried its own weight. Marcus thought about the men who'd threatened Emma, about the precision of the elevator sabotage, about the pattern emerging from what had seemed like isolated incidents. Someone with resources and patience was dismantling Sterling Industries from the inside, and Victoria had become collateral damage in a game she didn't know she was playing. She turned to face him, and the city lights caught her eyes in ways that made them seem less ice and more storm. I'm giving you access to everything. Building systems, maintenance logs, security footage. If someone sabotaged that elevator, there might be evidence. Can you find it? Marcus hesitated, old insecurity rising. I'm just a janitor. Victoria's expression hardened into something fierce. You're a decorated Army Ranger who specialized in infrastructure and combat engineering. Stop selling yourself short. The words hit harder than she probably intended, cutting through years of self-imposed limitations of accepting invisibility as the price of stability, of believing the Army had been his only shot at mattering. He met her eyes. I'll look. The next morning, while Emma colored in the living room and Victoria worked calls from her home office, Marcus sat in Sterling Tower's server room with a laptop in growing dread. The building systems were interconnected, centralized through software that controlled everything from HVAC to elevators to fire suppression. He started with the elevator failure, pulling maintenance logs and diagnostic reports. The hydraulic pressure had been degrading for weeks, slow enough that it looked like normal wear. But when Marcus cross-referenced the degradation pattern with his combat engineering training, he recognized something familiar. This was what sabotage looked like when someone knew what they were doing. He expanded his search, pulling records for every system malfunction in the past 6 months. HVAC failure on floor 31, fire suppression test failure on floor 18, backup generator errors, water pressure fluctuations, each one isolated, each one explainable, each one documented and dismissed as routine maintenance issues. Together they formed a pattern. Marcus pulled access logs, traced which credentials had been used to access the central management software. Most were maintenance staff IT personnel, people with legitimate reasons to be in the system. But one set of credentials appeared at irregular intervals, always late at night, always during times when the building was mostly empty. R. Caldwell, CFO, Richard Caldwell, Victoria's second in command. Marcus felt his blood go cold. He dug deeper, finding hidden directories, offshore server connections, encrypted files that took him an hour to crack using tools the Army had taught him existed. Inside those files was everything: timeline of sabotage, financial projections, post-takeover, stock manipulation records, a complete blueprint for destroying Sterling Industries and rebuilding it under new ownership. The final file was labeled Final Phase, dated for Friday at 14:15 numbers. 2 days from now, the international contract signing. Marcus pulled up the malware code and felt his stomach drop. Fire suppression override, electrical cascade failure, emergency exit locks, server room fire. This wasn't just sabotage. This was mass murder, dressed up as infrastructure failure, designed to kill everyone in the building during the signing ceremony and destroy the evidence in the same stroke. He grabbed his phone, called Victoria. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the distraction of someone pulled from deep concentration. The words tumbled out faster than he intended. "I found it. I know who's been sabotaging the building. It's Richard Caldwell. Your CFO has been planning this for 2 years, and he's going to kill everyone at the contract signing on Friday." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Marcus thought the connection had dropped. Then Victoria's voice came back, stripped of its professional polish, raw with shock. "Richard, that's impossible. He's been with the company for 8 years. We've worked together since my father died." Marcus pulled up the files on his screen, started forwarding them to Victoria's encrypted email. "Check what I just sent you. Malware signatures, access logs, financial records. He's been patient, systematic. This goes back months." He heard her typing, the click of keys followed by sharp intake of breath. When she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of realization crashing down. "The board vote. 2 years ago, when they chose me over Richard for CEO, I thought he'd accepted it. He congratulated me. We celebrated together." Marcus pulled up Richard's background file, scanning details he'd missed earlier. Stanford MBA, 15 years with Sterling Industries, passed over for promotion in favor of the founder's daughter. He's been planning a revenge since the day you got the position he thought he deserved. The connection fell quiet again, and Marcus could almost hear her rewiring her understanding of the past 2 years. Every boardroom alliance, every strategic decision, every moment of apparent loyalty hiding calculation and rage. When she spoke, her voice had shifted into something Marcus recognized from his squad leaders: tactical, focused, fear present but controlled. "We cancel the ceremony, postpone until Richard is arrested." He'd expected that response, had already considered and rejected it. "If we tip our hand, he runs. His files show offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. He's built escape routes. We need to catch him in the act with evidence that can't be disputed." Victoria's response came sharp with fear. "You want to walk into his trap?" Marcus looked at the code on his screen, at the timer counting down at the lives that hung in the balance between action and paralysis. "I want to control his trap, turn it against him. You proceed with the ceremony as planned. I infiltrate the server room, disable his malware, capture him when he tries to trigger the final phase." The silence stretched so long, Marcus thought she'd refuse. Then her voice came back, barely above a whisper. "What if something goes wrong? What if he hurts you?" The question carried weight beyond tactical concern, and Marcus felt the shift between them like tectonic plates realigning. "He won't. I'm better than him." Her next words came out fierce, almost angry. "Promise me you will be careful." Marcus thought about Emma sleeping in Victoria's guest room, about the life he'd been trying to protect by staying invisible, about the moment when invisibility stopped being protection and became complicity. "I promise." Over the next week, domesticity developed patterns that felt both foreign and natural. Victoria worked from home unprecedented in her 12-year corporate career, and Emma set up her homework at the corner of Victoria's mahogany desk like she belonged there. The questions came constant and curious. What's a quarterly report? Why do you work so much? When do you have fun? Victoria found herself answering with patience she didn't know she possessed, explaining supply chains and logistics to a 7-year-old who absorbed information like a sponge and asked follow-up questions that would have challenged her Harvard Business School professors. Emma taught back with equal enthusiasm. How to braid hair, which took Victoria 3 YouTube tutorials and Emma's gentle corrections. The definitive ranking of animated movies presented with such conviction that Victoria found herself invested in debates about whether Moana was better than Frozen. The absolute rule that pineapple did not belong on pizza delivered with the kind of moral certainty usually reserved for a constitutional law. Marcus watched from the kitchen while preparing meals that gradually became collaborative efforts. Victoria had never learned to cook, had subsisted on takeout and protein shakes for years, but Emma's delight in helping made the learning process less humiliating. They made spaghetti that was slightly overcooked, grilled cheese that was slightly burned, chocolate chip cookies that were slightly flat but disappeared within hours. He found himself noticing things about Victoria that penetrated the CEO armor, the way she tucked hair behind her ear when thinking hard about a problem. Her 3 distinct work expressions determined when starting a task, frustrated when hitting obstacles, quietly victorious when solving something complex. The genuine care she showed for her employees once he listened past the professional distance, heard her fighting with the board over severance packages and health benefits and treating people like humans rather than line items. She wasn't the ice queen he'd first encountered. She was lonely and scared and trying desperately to prove herself worthy of space she'd inherited rather than earned, fighting battles on so many fronts she'd forgotten how to rest. Late one evening, Emma finally asleep after an hour of negotiating bedtime, Marcus and Victoria found themselves on the balcony again. The city had become their confessional, the heightened darkness making honesty easier. Victoria asked the question without looking at him, her voice carrying vulnerability she usually kept locked down. When you were doing CPR, what were you thinking? Marcus took a long time answering, searching for truth that didn't expose too much. I was thinking I'd already lost one person I cared about. I wasn't going to lose another. She turned to face him, and the city lights caught her expression in ways that made his chest tight. You didn't even know me. The words came out before he could stop them. I knew enough. I knew you were exhausted and scared and trying to hold everything together alone. He paused, remembering soldiers he'd served with, the ones who thought asking for help meant admitting defeat. I knew you reminded me of people who'd rather break than bend, and I knew you deserved to live. Victoria's eyes filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. Her hand moved to her lips, touching them with the kind of wonder people reserve for miracles they didn't understand. I remember it, the kiss, your breath in my lungs, feeling like I was drowning in darkness, and then suddenly I could breathe again. She dropped her hand, met his eyes with an intensity that made everything else disappear. I've never felt that connected to someone. At the most fundamental level, you literally kept me alive with your breath. Marcus reached across the small distance separating them, took her hand. Her fingers were cold despite the mild night, and he wrapped them in warmth that felt like more than just body heat. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to be. The words hung between them, heavy with implication, with possibility, with the recognition that something was building here that transcended gratitude or obligation. Victoria squeezed his hand back and her voice came out barely above a whisper. Thank you for not giving up on me. Marcus pulled her closer, close enough that he could smell her shampoo, see the flecks of gold in her eyes. Never. I promise I'll never give up on you. The moment stretched, waited with the kiss that should have happened, that both of them wanted. Then Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the spell with the insistence of technology that didn't care about timing. He pulled it out, checked the security alert. The message was short, urgent, exactly what he'd been dreading. Unusual activity detected. Sterling Tower server room, remote access from offshore IP, timestamp 2347. Marcus looked up at Victoria, saw his own understanding reflected in her face. Richard, he's making his move. She stood and her expression shifted into something harder, more focused. Then we make ours. Richard Caldwell's apartment was minimalist chrome and glass, the kind of space that looked expensive but felt empty, as if the designer had confused wealth with taste. He sat at his home computer, Thursday night VPN, routing his connection through servers in 3 countries, and uploaded the final commands that would turn Sterling Tower into a killing floor. The code was elegant in its brutality. At 2:15 Friday afternoon, the fire suppression system would override, rendering sprinklers useless. 15 seconds later, the electrical grid would cascade into failure, plunging 40 floors into darkness. Emergency exits would lock automatically, trapping everyone inside. And in the chaos, a carefully timed spark in the server room would ignite hydraulic fluid that had been leaking for precisely this purpose. The fire would consume evidence of his sabotage while appearing accidental. The deaths would seem like tragic infrastructure failure, and Richard would be 3 miles away at a lunch meeting with witnesses who could confirm he'd been nowhere near the building when disaster struck. He reviewed the guest list for the signing ceremony one final time. Victoria Sterling, 7 board members including Harrison, who'd been subtly undermining her leadership for months. The Japanese consortium, German manufacturing partners, Brazilian distribution executives. 37 people total plus security and administrative staff. The international coverage would be extensive, the scandal devastating. Sterling Industries would never recover. Stock would crater. Richard's Shell Corporation would submit a buyout offer within hours, structured to look like salvation rather than opportunism. The board would accept because they'd have no choice, because Richard would position himself as the steady hand needed to guide the company through crisis. He'd become CEO over Victoria's ashes, literally and figuratively. The only variable was Marcus Reed. Richard had underestimated him, once dismissed him as irrelevant, and that mistake had cost him the clean assassination the elevator was supposed to provide. He wouldn't make the same error twice. The men Richard had sent to intimidate Marcus had failed, had come back with broken bones and excuses about Army Ranger training that sounded like justification for incompetence. But they'd served a purpose. Now Richard knew Marcus could fight, knew he had skills that made him dangerous, knew he'd been staying at Victoria's penthouse, which meant they were sharing more than just proximity. If Marcus discovered the pattern, if he connected the system failures to deliberate sabotage, if he traced the access logs back to Richard's credentials, the entire operation collapsed. Richard had covered his tracks carefully, but careful wasn't the same as perfect. Someone with military engineering background and motivation might piece together what others would miss. Richard checked the malware timer. 31 hours until activation. He could accelerate it, trigger the sequence early, but that would mean fewer casualties and less spectacle. The contract signing was the perfect moment. Maximum witnesses, maximum chaos, maximum destruction. He finished his scotch, shut down the laptop, and went to bed thinking about coronations and the price ambition demanded from those too weak to pay it. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline autumn weather that made the city look cleaner than it was. Victoria stood in her closet, choosing between navy and charcoal suits, aware that today would either cement her leadership or end it. The contract was worth $340 million, the kind of deal that transformed companies, that validated strategies, that proved to boards and shareholders and doubters that she'd earned her position through merit rather than inheritance. Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed for the daycare Victoria had arranged in Sterling Tower's 2nd floor. The facility was new, installed over board objections funded from Victoria's personal accounts when they'd refused the expense. Children of employees deserve safety and proximity, deserve parents who didn't have to choose between careers and family. The little girl's voice carried excitement, unburdened by the weight Victoria felt. "Mom says Navy makes you look powerful." Victoria turned, caught by the casual use of mom that Emma had started 3 days ago. They hadn't discussed it formally. Emma had simply decided Victoria had earned the title, had tested it cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. Each time Victoria heard it, something in her chest cracked a little wider. She knelt down, straightened Emma's collar with hands that wanted to shake. "Your mom has excellent fashion sense." Emma threw her arms around Victoria's neck, squeezing with the fierce affection children gave before the world taught them restraint. "You're going to do great today. Daddy says you're the strongest person he knows." The words landed with more impact than any board approval. Victoria held Emma close, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and innocence, and let herself believe for a moment that strength didn't require isolation. Marcus emerged from the guest room in dark slacks and a button-down that made him look less like maintenance and more like the military officer he'd been. Victoria had offered him a suit, but he'd refused, unwilling to pretend to be something he wasn't. The honesty of it made her love him a little more, though they hadn't yet used that word, though the feeling was becoming impossible to ignore. His eyes met hers across the room, carrying questions about the plan they'd rehearsed until 3 in the morning. She would proceed to the ceremony as scheduled. He would position himself in the server room 30 minutes early, would wait for Richard to make his move, would disable the malware, and capture the evidence that would end this. Victoria wanted to tell him to be safe, to not take risks, to let her cancel everything and deal with Richard through lawyers and law enforcement. But she understood why that wouldn't work. Richard had built escape routes. The evidence was digital deniable. Without catching him in the act, without recording his confession, without proof that couldn't be explained away, he'd vanish to the Cayman Islands and orchestrate their destruction from offshore. Instead, she crossed to Marcus, reached up and straightened his collar the way she'd straightened Emma's. Let her hands linger on his shoulders longer than necessary. Come back to us. His hands covered hers, warm and steady and certain. Always. On the Sterling Tower conference room occupied the northeast corner of the 44th floor, glass walls offering views of the harbor and the bridge and the city sprawling toward horizons that seemed infinite on clear days. International partners began arriving at 1:30, Japanese executives bowing with precise formality, Germans shaking hands with efficient firmness, Brazilians bringing warmth that cut through the corporate chill. Victoria greeted each delegation with the poise 12 years of practice had perfected, making small talk in 3 languages, projecting confidence she didn't entirely feel. Jessica Chen orchestrated logistics with her usual competence, directing people to seats, ensuring translation equipment functioned, triple-checking contracts that legal teams had already reviewed until the words blurred together. Board members filtered in, Harrison among them, his expression carrying the skepticism he'd worn like cologne since Victoria's promotion. He positioned himself near the back, arms crossed, clearly hoping for failure that would justify the coup he'd been planning. Richard entered at 1:50, impeccable in his charcoal suit, his expression carrying concern that would have been convincing if Marcus hadn't uncovered the truth. He approached Victoria with the solicitous manner of someone checking on her welfare. His voice carried just the right note of support. Big day. Are you nervous? Victoria met his eyes and saw a calculation there, saw him measuring her confidence, assessing whether she suspected anything. She made herself smile, made herself play the role of grateful colleague who valued his loyalty. Excited. This deal changes everything. Richard nodded, squeezed her shoulder in a gesture that would have seemed friendly if she didn't know he'd been planning her murder for 2 years. You've earned this. I'm proud of you. The words were acid burning where they touched, but Victoria held her expression steady. 14 minutes until the malware triggered. 14 minutes until Richard's plan either succeeded or collapsed. She checked her phone, reading the text Marcus had sent 5 minutes earlier. In position, ready. 40 floors below in the server room that most employees forgot existed. Marcus sat with his laptop connected to the mainframe and his fingers poised over keys that could save or condemn everyone above him. The room hummed with the white noise of cooling fans and hard drives, technology maintaining its own conversation in frequencies humans couldn't parse without instruments. He'd disabled the primary malware, had isolated Richard's code, and quarantined it where it couldn't execute. But deleting it completely would alert Richard that someone had interfered, would give him time to abort or escape. Marcus needed him to come here, needed him to attempt triggering the final phase while cameras recorded and evidence accumulated. The clock on his screen showed 1:58, 17 minutes until Richard's scheduled trigger time. Marcus pulled up the building's security feeds, watching the conference room fill with bodies, watching Victoria shake hands and smile, and pretend everything was normal. The door behind him opened with the soft hydraulic sigh of expensive hinges. Marcus didn't reach for the weapon he'd borrowed from Victoria's security detail, didn't do anything except keep typing as if he belonged here. Richard Caldwell's voice came from the doorway, carrying surprise and calculation in equal measure. I knew you'd figure it out. You're too competent for everyone's good. Marcus stopped typing, stood slowly, hands visible and non-threatening, turned to face the man who'd tried to kill the woman he loved, who'd threatened his daughter, who'd built an empire of destruction on patience and rage. He kept his voice level, conversational, the tone he'd used discussing weather rather than murder. It's over, Richard. Victoria knows everything. Police are reviewing the evidence right now. Richard stepped fully into the room and Marcus saw the gun tucked into his waistband, not drawn but present, a promise of escalation. The CFO laughed bitter and sharp. You're bluffing. If Victoria knew, she wouldn't be upstairs playing hostess with 100 witnesses in my kill zone. The admission hung between them, recorded by the phone in Marcus's pocket, evidence that couldn't be denied. Marcus held Richard's gaze. The kill zone you created. Why? Why destroy something you helped build? Richard's composure cracked, 2 years of controlled rage spilling through. I built this company. 8 years of 70-hour-week strategies that turned millions into billions, vision that Charles Sterling took credit for while paying me a fraction of what I deserved. His voice rose, echoing off server racks. And when he died, who got rewarded? His princess daughter, who'd barely learned how to read a balance sheet. Victoria, who earned nothing, who inherited everything, who played CEO while I did the actual work. Marcus watched calculation battle emotion across Richard's face. She's a good leader, better than you'd ever be. The gun came out fast, Richard's hands steady with the confidence of someone who'd made this decision hours ago. She's a placeholder, a legacy hire whose only qualification is her last name. I have an MBA from Stanford, 15 years of experience. I deserve that office. Marcus didn't move toward the weapon, didn't give Richard excuse to fire. His voice stayed calm, rational, the tone that had talked down Taliban fighters who were seconds from detonating. So you decided to kill her, kill everyone in the building, burn the evidence, and rebuild as CEO over the ashes. Richard steadied the gun, aiming center mass, the kind of shot that suggested familiarity with firearms. The elevator was supposed to be clean. Quick. You ruined that by playing hero. Now I have to be messier, but the result's the same. Victoria dies. Sterling Industries falls. I rise from the rubble as the man who tried to save it. Marcus took a calculated risk, let truth into his voice. Shooting me won't stop this. The evidence is already uploaded to cloud servers Victoria controls. Even if you trigger your malware, even if the fire destroys these servers, she has everything. Richard's hand wavered, doubt flickering across his expression. He pulled out his phone with his free hand, thumbed to his banking app, and Marcus watched his face pale as he saw transaction logs being copied in real time. How did you... The words came out matter of fact, carrying weight of experience Richard couldn't match. I'm not just a janitor. I was an Army Ranger. We specialize in infiltration, extraction, and making sure evidence survives hostile environments. You never had a chance. Richard's finger moved toward the trigger, desperation replacing calculation. Marcus tensed, ready to move to close the distance before the gun fired, to use the close-quarters combat training that had kept him alive through 12 years of war. But Richard's phone buzzed and the distraction was enough. Marcus surged forward, grabbed Richard's wrist, twisted with precise force that dislocated the thumb. The gun clattered to the floor, skittering under a server rack. Richard threw a wild punch with his free hand, caught Marcus on the jaw hard enough to snap his head sideways. The pain was distant, irrelevant, buried under the clarity combat brought. Marcus deflected Richard's neck strike, countered with a nerve strike to the shoulder that deadened Richard's arm from elbow to fingertips. Richard kicked low, trying for Marcus's knee, but Marcus had fought men trained in Krav Maga and Muay Thai, and every dirty fighting style the Middle East offered. He swept Richard's supporting leg, sent him crashing backward into the server rack. Metal groaned. Richard grabbed a keyboard, swung it like a club plastic, shattering against Marcus's forearm. Marcus stepped inside the arc, drove his elbow into Richard's sternum with enough force to crack ribs. Richard gasped, folding around the pain, and Marcus hooked his ankle, took him to the ground, hard. The concrete was unforgiving. Richard's head bounced once, twice, consciousness flickering. Marcus pinned him with a knee on his spine and mine. They grabbed both wrists and held them with one hand while pulling zip ties from his pocket with the other. Security measure Victoria had insisted on over Marcus's protest that he wouldn't need them. He secured Richard's wrists behind his back, then his ankles, checking that circulation wasn't compromised. but movement was impossible. Richard groaned, tried to struggle, achieved nothing except exhausting what strength the fight had left him. Marcus pulled out his phone, stopped the recording that had captured everything. "Don't move. Police are 30 seconds out." Richard's voice came out broken, defeated, still carrying threads of the rage that had consumed him. "She doesn't deserve it. Victoria will never be half the leader her father was. You've tied yourself to someone who's going to fail, who's going to destroy everything you've attached yourself to." The door burst open before Marcus could respond. Victoria entered, first moving with the kind of speed that suggested she'd run from the ceremony the moment he'd texted. Security personnel flooded behind her, Daniel Park, and three others who looked like they could handle professional operators. Two police detectives followed, badges, visible expressions carrying the satisfaction of cops who'd been briefed on exactly what kind of case they were walking into. Victoria's eyes found Marcus, first scanning for injuries, for signs of damage. He saw relief flood her expression when she registered he was standing relatively intact, holding position over a secured threat. Then she looked at Richard on the floor, hands and feet restrained, blood from his split lips staining the concrete. Something in her expression shifted from fear to fury to something colder and more final. Her voice came out ice, every word carrying weight of betrayal and judgment. "You were supposed to be my partner, someone I trusted. You congratulated me when I became CEO. You smiled at my father's funeral. You stood beside me through every board meeting for 2 years." She paused, and the pause was heavier than words. "And the whole time you were planning my murder." Richard tried to speak, to offer explanation or justification. Victoria held up her hands, silencing him with the gesture's finality. "The only thing you need to say is how you want your lawyer contacted, because that's the last decision you'll make as a free man for the next 20 years. The detectives moved in, reading Richard his rights with the practiced cadence of people who'd done this 1,000 times. They hauled him upright, started walking him toward the elevator that would carry him to processing and arraignment in the machinery of justice that moves slower than vengeance, but more permanently. Richard looked back once, his expression carrying hatred so pure it almost had its own weight. "This isn't over. You think you've won, Victoria, but you're still Charles Sterling's soft daughter. You'll fail without me. You'll prove your father right." Victoria stepped closer, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Richard to strain to hear. "My father was wrong about a lot of things, but the most important thing he was wrong about is that strength and kindness can't coexist. That power requires cruelty. That leadership means being alone." She glanced at Marcus, at the man who'd saved her life 3 times now, who taught her that accepting help wasn't weakness. "I'm going to prove that real strength comes from the people we trust, the communities we build, the courage to be vulnerable. And I'm going to do it while you watch from prison." The detectives pulled Richard toward the door, and his protest faded into the hallway's echo. Victoria stood in the server room, surrounded by evidence of conspiracy and salvation, and Marcus watched her transform from the terrified woman who'd woken in a hospital bed to the leader she'd been fighting to become. She crossed to him, checked his jaw where Richard's punch had landed, her fingers gentle against skin that would bruise by evening. "You kept your promise." Marcus covered her hand with his, turned his face to kiss her palm. "Always." The contract signing resumed at 3:30, delayed but not canceled, the kind of power move that sent messages about resilience and commitment. International partners had been briefed on the attempted sabotage, the CFO's arrest, the dramatic rescue that had prevented catastrophe. If anything, the scandal made them more interested, more convinced that Victoria Sterling possessed the kind of strength her father's company required. Press filled the back of the room, cameras rolling, journalists typing furiously on phones, already composing headlines about corporate espionage and the CEO who survived 3 assassination attempts. The story would dominate business news for weeks, drive Sterling Industries stock up 15%, prove to skeptical board members that Victoria's leadership could weather storms that would sink lesser executives. Victoria stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had questioned her competence, her experience, her right to occupy the space her father had built. Jessica had prepared remarks, safe corporate language, about partnership and growth and shared prosperity. Victoria had read them once in the elevator, then deleted them from her tablet. Some truths were too important for prepared speeches. She waited until the room settled, until conversations died into expectant silence, until every eye focused on her. Then she began speaking from a place deeper than strategy, from the part of herself she'd buried for 10 years, under armor that nearly killed her. Her voice carried to the back row without amplification, steady but weighted with emotion she didn't try to hide. 6 weeks ago, I made a terrible mistake. I fired a man who was trying to save my life. The room went completely still. Even the journalist stopped typing. His name is Marcus Reed. He warned me about a failing elevator in front of my employees, and I fired him because accepting his warning would have made me look weak in front of people whose opinions I desperately needed. She paused, let that land. I was exhausted, terrified, losing control of my company. The board was questioning my leadership. My CFO was undermining me. And when Marcus stopped me in that lobby, all I could think about was how incompetent I must look if a janitor knew more about my building than I did. Victoria's hands gripped the podium, knuckles white. Minutes later, that elevator nearly killed me. And Marcus, the man I just humiliated and fired, ran back into a burning building to save my life. He climbed 42 flights of stairs. He broke through steel doors with a fire axe. He performed CPR and refused to let me die. She looked directly at Marcus, standing at the back, with Emma on his shoulders so she could see. He saved me 2 more times after that. Once from hired attackers who were sent to silence him. Once from my own CFO who'd been planning my assassination for 2 years. But the most important thing he saved me from was the person I'd become. The words came harder now, fighting through 10 years of conditioning that said vulnerability was weakness, that emotion was failure, that leaders stood alone. I spent a decade building walls. I refused help because I thought needing anyone meant I wasn't strong enough. I equated independence with strength, isolation with power, cruelty with competence. Her voice cracked slightly. My father believed I was too soft to lead this company, so I became hard, cold. I fired anyone who questioned me, promoted those who showed absolute loyalty, treated my employees like resources to be managed rather than people to be valued. Victoria paused, gathering herself. Marcus taught me something revolutionary. He taught me that real strength isn't refusing help. Real strength is having the courage to accept it. Real power isn't standing alone. It's building communities where everyone's voice matters, where a janitor's expertise is valued as much as a CEO's authority, where we measure success by how we treat the people at every level of our organization. She gestured to Marcus, to Emma, to the future they represented. Marcus Reed was a janitor in this building. I treated him as invisible beneath my notice, someone who existed to serve without question. But he's also a decorated Army Ranger, a combat engineer, a devoted father, and the man who saved my life 3 times while teaching me how to actually live it. The applause started small, grew, became something genuine rather than polite. Victoria waited for it to subside. Today I'm announcing that Marcus will join Sterling Industries' executive team as Chief of Technical Operations and Safety. His job is to ensure that every voice in this company matters, that we value competence over the credentials, character over connections, expertise over titles, that we never again dismiss someone's concerns because they don't have the right degree or the right position or the right last name. She looked directly at the board members at Harrison in particular. And to this board I say clearly, if you disagree with this decision, if you think I'm too emotional or too armed or too willing to elevate a janitor to executive leadership, then I invite you to find a different CEO. Because this is who I am now. This is the leader I choose to be. And I'm done pretending that strength requires cruelty or that power demands isolation. The applause this time was thunderous. International partners stood their approval, carrying more weight than any board vote. Journalists captured the moment from every angle, ready writing stories about the CEO who transformed corporate culture through personal crisis. Board members exchanged glances, calculating, and Victoria saw Harrison's resistance crumble as he realized the tide had turned against him. The contracts were signed with ceremony and champagne $40 million deals that would reshape Sterling Industries' international presence. Partners lined up to shake Victoria's hand, to meet Marcus, to tell Emma how proud they were of her father. The little girl accepted the attention with grace beyond her years, chattering about wanting to be an engineer who built safe elevators. As the crowd dispersed and journalists filed out and the conference room emptied toward normalcy, Emma slipped away from her father and walked with deliberate purpose toward Victoria. Her expression carried the gravity that preceded important questions, the look she got when solving problems that mattered. She stopped in front of Victoria, small and serious and brave. "Can I ask you something?" Victoria knelt without hesitation, bringing herself to Emma's level, the way she'd learned made children feel heard. "Of course, sweetheart. Anything." Emma twisted her hands together, suddenly shy in ways she rarely was. "My mommy died when I was 4. I don't really remember her very much. Just some things like how she smelled like flowers and laughed a lot." Her voice got quieter. "Daddy says she was kind and smart and loved me more than anything in the world." Victoria's heart clenched, knowing what was coming, not sure she could handle the weight of it. Emma took a deep breath, gathering courage. "And you're kind and smart. You bought me stuffed animals and helped with my science project and taught me about supply chains and made Daddy smile again." The words came faster, tumbling over each other. "So I was thinking maybe, could you be my mom, not instead of her? I'll always love her, but also, like a bonus mom, if that's okay." The room had gone silent again. The handful of people remaining, stopping to witness this moment that was somehow more significant than contracts or corporate drama or anything the business world valued. Victoria felt tears she'd learned to suppress break through, felt her chest compress with emotion that had no professional equivalent. She pulled Emma into her arms, holding tight, breathing in strawberry shampoo and innocence, and the possibility of healing wounds she hadn't known she carried. Her voice came out thick, barely controlled. "Emma, that would be the greatest honor of my entire life. Being your mom, your bonus mom, your person. Yes, absolutely yes." Emma's arms wrapped around Victoria's neck, squeezing with the fierce joy of children who'd just gotten what they wanted most. "Really, you're not just saying it?" Victoria pulled back enough to meet Emma's eyes, blue like her mother's had been, like Marcus's would never be, like this second chance at family that Victoria hadn't earned, but would cherish anyway. "Really, truly, more than anything. I love you, Emma. I already love you." Marcus appeared beside them and his arms came around both, and Victoria understood in that moment what she'd been missing for 34 years. This connection, this vulnerability, this courage to let people in and trust they wouldn't destroy her for showing weakness. Emma looked between them, her smile brilliant enough to power the building. "Does this mean I get to live in the penthouse because that bathroom is really cool?" The laughter broke the tension and Victoria found herself crying and laughing simultaneously, emotions she'd kept separate for so long, colliding into something new and overwhelming and perfect. Marcus kissed the top of her head, then Emma's, his own eyes wet. His voice carried weight of promises fulfilled and futures imagined. "We're already home, sweetheart. Wherever we're together, that's home." 6 months transformed geography and identity in ways Victoria would have thought impossible before learning that transformation was just another word for growth. The penthouse became genuinely inhabited, Emma's artwork covering the refrigerator, Marcus's coffee habit, colonizing the kitchen, the pristine white furniture acquiring the marks of actual living that interior designers would have mourned. Sterling Industries thrived under leadership that measured success by employee satisfaction as much as quarterly earnings. The wellness program Victoria had proposed at 24 finally launched, funded by money Richard had diverted to offshore accounts. The child care center expanded. Profit sharing extended to maintenance crews and administrative staff. Marcus's safety protocols prevented 3 potential accidents in the first month, proving that technical expertise mattered more than fancy titles. The board, seeing employee retention improve and productivity spike, stopped questioning Victoria's decisions. Harrison retired, replaced by someone who understood that corporate responsibility and profitability weren't mutually exclusive. Richard's trial proceeded toward the inevitable conclusion of overwhelming evidence, and Victoria attended exactly once, watched him led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuit and chains, and felt nothing except relief the chapter was closed. Emma flourished with the kind of acceleration gifted children showed when given resources and encouragement. Her science projects grew more ambitious, her questions more complex, her confidence in her own intelligence unshakable. She called Victoria Mom without hesitation, now called Marcus, Dad, with the same certainty, treated the blended family they'd created as the most natural thing in the world. Marcus struggled more with the transition, old insecurity warring with new responsibility. He wore suits that felt like costumes, attended meetings where people asked his opinion with genuine respect, made decisions that affected thousands of lives. Some days he still wanted to grab a mop and disappear into the comfort of invisible labor. Most days Victoria found him and reminded him he'd earned his position through competence, not charity. They found rhythm and domesticity that neither had expected to want. Morning coffee while Emma did homework. Evenings on the balcony talking about everything and nothing. Weekends at the park or the science museum or the beach building, sandcastles, and memories with equal dedication. The evening Marcus proposed, autumn had returned with the kind of sunset that made the city look like it was built from gold and amber. He'd spent all day setting up the Sterling Tower rooftop, roping Emma into conspiracy with the enthusiasm only 7-year-olds brought to secrets. Candles lined the perimeter in patterns Emma had insisted would be romantic, roses clustered around the center in colors Victoria had once mentioned liking. Emma dragged Victoria up through the service elevator, chattering about needing to show her something important on the roof, refusing to explain until they stepped out into the carefully orchestrated scene. Marcus stood in the center, still uncomfortable in the dress shirt and slacks that Emma had insisted he wear, holding the ring box he'd spent 2 weeks choosing. His hands shook slightly, nerves he usually controlled deserting him in the moment that mattered most. Victoria stopped, took in the setup, understood immediately what was happening. Her hand went to her mouth, eyes widening, the carefully maintained composure she wore for the world cracking into something raw and real. Marcus's voice came out steadier than he felt, carrying the weight of promises he'd learned to make again after thinking that part of his life had died with Rachel. 6 months ago, you hired me for the worst job interview of my life. You fired me. I saved you, you saved me back, and somehow we became a family. You taught me that second chances aren't just possible, they're necessary. That healing doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to live fully again. He knelt and Emma bounced beside him with barely contained excitement. The box opened, revealing a ring that was elegant without being ostentatious, significant without being show-off expensive, exactly what Victoria would have chosen if he'd asked. Victoria Sterling, will you marry me? Will you be Emma's mom and my wife and my partner in every possible way? Will you keep teaching me that accepting help isn't weakness? That building connections is more important than building walls? That love is the strongest foundation anyone can stand on? Victoria was crying now, tears she no longer tried to hide, emotions she'd spent years burying flooding through in ways that felt like drowning and breathing simultaneously. She nodded before finding words, nodded until speech became possible. Her voice came out thick, broken, beautiful. Yes, God, yes, 1,000 times yes. Marcus slid the ring onto her finger, and Emma launched herself at both of them with a squeal that probably carried to the street below. They collapsed into a pile of laughter and tears and joy, the three of them tangled together on the rooftop, while the city spread below them like witness to this moment that mattered more than any contract or corporate victory ever could. Emma's voice came muffled from somewhere in the middle of the hug pile. Can we have cake now? You said there'd be cake. Marcus laughed, kissed the top of her head. Yes, sweetheart, there's cake. Victoria held them both, felt the solidness of them, the reality of family she'd thought she'd sacrifice for ambition. We're really doing this. We're really becoming a family. Emma pulled back enough to look at her with 7-year-old seriousness. We already are a family. The wedding just makes it official. The wedding happened 3 months later in the same rooftop space, intimate and deliberate, witnessed by people who mattered rather than people who should be impressed. Jessica served as maid of honor, still managing logistics even for personal events. Emma was flower girl, taking the responsibility with gravity that made the photographer weep. Marcus wore his dress uniform, army blues, with the medals he'd earned through service he still didn't talk about much. Victoria wore simple, white, elegant, without being theatrical, the kind of dress that suggested beginning rather than spectacle. The vows they'd written carried weight of experience and loss and the courage to try again. Victoria spoke about walls and breath and the kiss that had saved her life 3 times, about learning that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that power without compassion was just cruelty wearing expensive suits. Marcus spoke about darkness and light, about the day he'd thought he was finished with love and purpose, about a woman in a red dress who'd been rude and desperate and human enough to save. He spoke about second chances, about Emma giving him reason to be visible again, about Victoria giving him permission to be worthy again. When the officiant pronounced them married, Marcus kissed Victoria with the same intensity he'd used doing CPR, but this time it was about beginning rather than survival, about choosing to build something rather than prevent ending. Emma cheered and the handful of witnesses applauded, and somewhere in the city below, life continued in patterns that didn't include this moment, but would be forever changed by it anyway. The reception was small, intimate, the kind of gathering where conversation mattered more than speeches. Emma danced with everyone, spinning in her dress until dizziness made her giggle. Marcus and Victoria swayed together while music played, and he whispered things in her ear that made her blush and laugh and hold him tighter. Late in the evening, after Emma had fallen asleep on a couch and guests had filtered into the night, Victoria and Marcus stood at the rooftop edge, looking at the city they'd both almost died in, that they'd both learned to live in again. Victoria thought about the moment in the stairwell, about Marcus's mouth on hers breathing life back into lungs that had forgotten their purpose, about the connection that had started in desperation and grown into something neither of them had been looking for. Her voice came out quiet, reflective. Do you remember what it felt like, that moment in the stairwell, when you were doing CPR? Marcus pulled her closer, his arms a shelter she no longer feared. Every detail. It was the scariest moment of my life. She turned in his embrace, looked up at him with eyes that carried gratitude and love and understanding. It was also the most important. You didn't just save my life. You taught me how to actually live it. Taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, that building connections matters more than building empires, that love isn't a distraction from success, it's the whole point. Marcus kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. You taught me I didn't have to be invisible to be safe, that Emma deserved a father who participated in life rather than observed it, that second chances don't dishonor first loves, they honor them by choosing to keep living. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd been broken, finding wholeness in each other, finding family in choices rather than blood, finding home in vulnerability rather than walls. 5 years later, the Sterling Tower lobby bore a bronze plaque that most people walked past without reading. The inscription was simple, direct, the kind of truth that didn't need embellishment. This building stands because of every person who maintains it, cleans it, protects it, works within it. From the executive suite to the maintenance crew, from the mailroom to the boardroom, every voice matters. No one is invisible here. Everyone is valued. Below the words, a photograph. Marcus and Victoria on their wedding day, Emma between them, and a small boy of 2 named Charles after the grandfather he'd never meet, but would exceed in every measure that mattered. Victoria Sterling Reed ran Sterling Industries with the kind of leadership that valued profit and people equally, that measured success in employee retention as much as stock price, that understood corporate responsibility meant more than quarterly reports. The company thrived not despite her approach, but because of it, proving what her father had never understood, that strength and compassion weren't enemies. They were partners. Marcus served as chief operations officer, the janitor turned executive, who revolutionized how corporations thought about infrastructure and safety and the expertise that existed at every level of organization. He gave talks at business schools, wrote articles about military skills, translating to civilian leadership, mentored veterans struggling with the transition he had mastered. Emma was 12 now, already taking advanced engineering courses, building robots and circuits, and dreams that grew more ambitious each year. She remembered her mother Rachel and the way Marcus kept her memory alive, not as competition with Victoria, but as the foundation that made their family possible. And sometimes late at night when the city was quiet and Emma and Charles were asleep, Victoria and Marcus would stand on their balcony and talk about the moment that changed everything. About a kiss that had been about survival transforming into a love that built legacies. Marcus would touch her lips the way she sometimes touched his, remembering. It all started here, with breathing life into you. Victoria would lean into him, into the safety of arms that had refused to let her die. And it became the life worth living, the family worth building, the love worth every risk. The city lights spread below them like a promise that darkness could be beautiful, that broken things could be rebuilt, that second chances were real for people brave enough to accept help strong enough to be vulnerable, or wise enough to understand that the greatest strength wasn't standing alone, it was knowing who to stand beside.